He always takes something there in the story or there in some empirical study, and then he makes two leaps, and then he makes 10 more leaps that are way too far. He goes like just beyond what you can reasonably infer, and then he takes 100 steps past that and covers it up with really obscure language. So we recorded this podcast on Jordan Peterson, religion and culture, and we critique some of his ideas, both insightful and harmful. But I wanted to take a second to paint a broader picture of his ideology and his very complicated persona. So broadly, while he says he's not a conservative, he talks very frequently about the status quo, about how we should maintain the status quo, or about how things are getting better on their own anyway, and so we don't need to do anything about it. And not infrequently, the status quo he defends is out of touch with the social issues of the present, and so that winds up being harmful. And in that way, I would say he is conservative, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from him. One value he espouses is the importance of mining material for what they are worth instead of just criticizing. And so we should take that attitude towards him as well. In his conservatism, there is a conservationist attitude towards culture, myth, and religion that maybe we can learn something from. So he believes that these have all been adapted over millennia and contain valuable wisdom in themselves that should be humbly mined for what it's worth. And here he can come off as both appreciative and discerning. One value he traces back to mythology in particular is the need for occasional radical and progressive change, which is somewhat ironic given his conservative attitude. But he at least recognizes the need for occasional radical and progressive change as environments adapt. The biggest critique I have of him is kind of ironically, he recognizes the need for radical change, but he never says anything that convinces me he really sees the problems motivating progressive change today. He never highlights any of these things, such as racial inequality, gender inequality, wealth inequality. Two easy examples that come to mind of where he fails to highlight what he should. He upholds capitalism without acknowledging, capitalism, the private ownership of industry and property, without acknowledging that some productivity and efficiency should be sacrificed to reduce wealth inequality. And sometimes it seems that he will redefine patriarchy as merit-based hierarchy to make it more palatable, while simultaneously complaining that the left reconceptualizes gender and sex as distinct in a linguistic foul play. And that just, to me, seems like hypocritical nonsense. An example in this podcast we consider at length is religion. And here, again, I think he sees great value in the past, but kind of misses the mark. So Jordan Peterson likes to refer to the religious domain as the study of values or the effective nature of things. And he thinks that religion does this through intentional or unintentional personification. And he would acknowledge that fiction does this too, but I think he fails to acknowledge that what makes religion distinct is that they require faith because they lack definitive evidence, or in some cases require the rejection of definitive evidence. And being subjective, morality could be included in this, but much more. Religious stories, I think, are very similar to works of fiction, great works of fiction perhaps, but they also are those works of fiction that carry with them metaphysical baggage and a whole host of assumptions that, if true, imply at very least that our modern understanding of the world, which underlies all of modern technology from cars, computers to planes, is either mistaken or can sometimes be suspended in the presence of a miracle. Historically, religion has not empirically improved morality, I would say. And religions can get buy into their dogma precisely by making you sacrifice your most fundamental values. And then once you've done that, you either have to, to leave is to admit that you have been supremely immoral. So people will have a cognitive dissonance that forces them to stay. Jordan Peterson may acknowledge that some of these arguments, but he never really mentions them. So I think in that way he gives cover to some of the negative aspects of religion. And I will admit there are positive aspects as well. I just don't think that he ever really addresses both sides of the coin. On the flip side, again, to emphasize what Jordan Peterson does well, there are positive lessons. And an easy example here is that he points to where the left can go too far. It's clear when the political right goes too far because it veers into racial superiority. And he would argue that the left can go too far, but that's hard to tell. And he says it does this when it demands, perfect equality of outcome, independent of the value of contribution, the value of work. And that's kind of an essentially communist or counterproductive attitude that we should have equality of outcome independent of contribution. An example we could look at more closely for a second is his critique of postmodernism, which he thinks, well, postmodernism, one way to think of it is that it's essentially promoting cynicism towards historical values, but it's really anti-objectivity in all areas. So Jordan Peterson believes that we should mine wisdom from the past instead of just criticizing it, and he can be very good at articulating when a cynicism of the status quo of our current institutions goes too far in its criticism that it becomes counterproductive. His idea is that we should not get rid of such a system without salvaging the best parts. One point I think he's better at articulating is that although there is much to improve in current institutions, by and large they provide great value. And in the West, or in wealthy liberal democracies, not every system is radically corrupt, nor is the postmodern attitude correct that everything from cultural values to historical events are so radically subjective, or I guess, more than just subjective, arbitrary and useless, that they are prone to corruption or exist purely for the sake of power and exploitation. For instance, the regulated ownership of private property that exists in capitalism and the value of liberalism that underpins it, I don't think that's just a power grab. I think it's the only reliable, beneficial system in the long term. And of course, it needs to be regulated, and wealth inequality needs to be greatly redistributed by the government. And we'll talk about this in another video, but I don't think it's just purely a power grab. Some people, he likes to say, don't aim at the truth. They just construct beliefs based on what helps or harms. And I think that's true and counterproductive in the long term. When you veer into the territory of saying something cannot be objectively true, only empowering or disempowering one group or another, then that destroys the need for any debate. And it also means that you can just arbitrarily lower your standards when it's convenient for you to do so, maybe when it helps. The left would do this, I think, for a good purpose when it helps minority group. But I think that's counterproductive in the long term to say that, if some segment of the population isn't doing well, then instead of helping them, we should just lower the standards. And I think Jordan Peterson has some good articulation of this. Putting aside the need to trust intent and have common values, if there is no objectivity to be known, only what helps or harms people, then there's no need to discuss and learn and debate. And I think Peterson is right in pointing to a decline of the appreciation of that. Again, he says it's true that all ideals argue against for some people who don't meet them, but that's not a reason to toss out all of our ideals, to toss out liberalism, for instance. And that idea may be uncomfortable, but what we have at the moment is both sides of the aisle wanting the other to reckon with their self-righteous offense or discomfort, but won't do that themselves. In conclusion, there was one debate I saw between Slavoj Žižek and Peterson, and Žižek quotes Hegel saying something like, "Evil is the eye that sees evil everywhere." And what I think Jordan Peterson gets right is that the far left, and I think this actually applies to the right as well, though he doesn't acknowledge it, they think they have the moral high ground by labeling everything evil. But labeling everything evil is not a virtue when it's not evil. And it can justify any type of violence against those that it thinks are evil. And instead, sometimes it makes sense to look within and make sure you're not just labeling everything around you as evil. When it comes to considering conflicting values, something I think that's useful to keep in mind is that most of these debates are not issues of good and evil. At worst, they are good versus ignorance, but more often than not, then they are an issue of competing virtues. Recognizing this takes deliberate mental effort each time. And Hegel proposes thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This may sound cliche, but a comprehensive synthesis of values on the left and right is what is needed. Perhaps one small part of this is to recognize, as Sam Harris says, there are objective facts about subjective things. So we can discuss the objectively best process or the best higher order values for meeting our shared fundamental values, even if subjective value systems as a whole differ from person to person. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Oh, and one last thing. I just wanted to drop a link below to Natalie Wynn. She's a trans YouTuber and philosopher. Don't get your thoughts on gender from Jordan Peterson. Get them from her. Her ideas are far more insightful. Also, she has a great and relevant video on envy, where she discusses, envy, the idea that, if I can't have this, then no one can. And she discusses Nietzsche. She points to the idea in Nietzsche's genealogy of morality that envy often masquerades as morality. And, Peterson echoes this when he denounces counterproductive, bitter utopians disguising envy as morality. She argues that Jordan Peterson is right when he says that the left has self-righteous, resentful Twitter mobs that disguise their envy and resentment in moral claims, and maybe particularly in academic postmodernism. So agreeing with Jordan Peterson, but here's the crucial bit. This isn't all of the left, nor is it unique to the left. And Nietzsche actually thinks of Christian morality in these envious terms. So highly relevant, and check it out in the description below. Well, all right, let's begin.
3, 2, 1, podcast.
All right, so today we're going to talk about Jordan Peterson and morality. Largely, I want to discuss the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. It spanned, 12 months and several years, multiple planets. But before we get there, I think we should just briefly talk about Jordan Peterson, because he's a controversial figure. So I guess I want to start with a bit of a critique and then defense of what I like about Jordan Peterson. So I guess first it has to be acknowledged that he became controversial around trans issues. So he is from Canada, and the way he read some proposed legislation there is that gender pronouns would be mandated by the state. So if you misgender someone, then that is a federal crime. And kind of putting aside what you believe about the use of pronouns, and I know at least Tyler Beck and I support the use of people's preferred pronouns, but putting aside what you believe about that, like, he was arguing there for not mandating it legally, which is something that I think is a bit less controversial. So that's how I kind of blew up. From watching videos with him, I do think that his views on kind of gender are a little antiquated. I think he's kind of from the school that doesn't really see a difference between gender and sex, and doesn't really see the use in gender as a concept. So I guess, like, without diving into that issue, I would just label that as a thing that needs to be noted, as I would list as a critique of Jordan Peterson. I think he also has some other kind of political and philosophical issues that I would take with him. So if I were to label those critiques, they would be that he is elitist and defeatist. So I think he's
names for your opinions. Makes it easier to adopt.
That wasn't intentional, but yeah, I think to boil it down to two words, that would be it. So
elitist and defeatist.
So elitist in the sense that, like, well, he always tells people, like, when someone tells me what they love, then I try and, deduce what they hate and see if that's really what's motivating them. So, he talks about, like, socialism, and he's like, socialists say they love the poor, but really they just hate the rich. And I'm like, well, maybe some, but, like, let's apply that to Jordan Peterson. He says he just loves Enlightenment values, and hates bitter utopians who exploit, like, social justice causes for their malevolence. But I kind of just think he hates activists. Like, there are some interviews with him where someone says, how should I improve the world? And he, like, well, I think you should start with yourself. And he does acknowledge that, like, in North Korea, that doesn't really make sense. Like, if the state is so oppressive that it influences every aspect of your life, then, getting your house in order first isn't necessarily tenable. But he doesn't seem to acknowledge that you can, like, be an imperfect person and also make progress on politics. From my point of view, it's kind of a genetic fallacy that says, like, the person espousing these ideas is the problem. And it kind of leaves our democracy in a place that's, almost oligarchic, in the sense that only those he deems educated enough and industrious enough and virtuous enough to participate should participate. So you could kind of sum this up in the response he gave to some activists, saying, like, what should I do if I want to improve the world? And he's like, go get some degrees first. I'm pretty sure he said something like that, maybe word for word. The point was, like, you should improve yourself. You should get more educated before you try and improve the world. And I feel like that's a very elitist view that doesn't really leave anyone able to participate in the government.
Can we push back on that?
Yeah, no, please push back on that.
So I think you're partially correct in that assessment, but I don't think that his emphasis is on being credentialed. In fact, he has in his thinking, there seems to be a rather negative appraisal of higher education, generally speaking. For example, I feel like you're accurate, though, in that he is basically saying, like, get yourself in order first. But I don't think that's necessarily, like, in terms of education. I think he means maybe education, being learned is part of it, but I think also is, like, the character element is very important, like developing a strong, and especially we could talk about, like, the masculine character that he harps on a lot, like being a strong man. I think that if it comes off sometimes as, like, elitist, it's just him saying, like, take care of yourself first before you try improving these large scale social issues. I don't think, all that to say that I think that he's kind of negative in general about credentialism. So I don't think he's really saying, like, you have to be, like, super educated first. I think he's saying, like, make sure that you, quote unquote, are in order, so to speak, before you try putting things out in the world in order. I don't think it's necessarily elitist in that sense, but it might be like he's setting way too high a bar for a person before they can feel like they have any potential to make a change out in the world, which I would agree with you there on. But I don't think he's necessarily being elitist.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mean in terms of a particular credential so much as, like, he holds people to such a high standard. Like, at what point in his mind are you a good enough person to participate in the government and in making society better?
Yeah, in that sense, I think that that's the accurate part of your assessment. I just thought I heard you saying that he was telling people, like, get a degree first. And I'm saying by that he means what you're saying about the high standard being set
Right.
individual, not necessarily being an elite person first, but meeting some sort of ethical standard, some sort of, in that I agree with you.
Yeah. I guess, like, this is kind of a rhetorical strategy of his, that it seems like he doesn't know that person he was responding to. Maybe they do meet his standard for being a good enough person to change society. But I feel like that's just a response that he says to anyone. I'm like, okay, is there anyone you wouldn't say that to? You'd be like, yeah, thanks for helping. Thanks for making society better.
Yeah, probably just himself, right?
I don't know. I'm sure there are people he respects, but I don't know what his criteria are. I think this also comes across a little bit in his writing and speech. I guess not speech so much, but like I'm reading Maps of Meaning by him, and I guess some of the ideas are interesting and things that already exist out there in the world. Like he talks about the is-ought problem and exploitation trade-offs. But the way he talks about it is kind of in such esoteric language that people who are familiar with these ideas already know them, and people who aren't familiar with these ideas would never understand a word he's saying. So I feel like that also contributes to my perspective of him being a little elitist in his language, where he can just write something so vaguely and flowery that he can almost say, well, you don't understand me, because his language is just so inaccessible.
Good point.
I don't know where Dr. Late to the Party has gone.
Go on to defeatist then.
Yeah, well, I guess he's one thing in particular struck me as defeatist when he talked about climate change, where he kind of said like 2 points. One is that we won't be able to measure or do anything about it anyway, and measure the interventions we have done, so why bother? And the second thing that seemed kind of contradictory to me was that he mentioned like the Green Revolution took care of overpopulation that the planet was really concerned about before the turn of the century. And so he's like, well, science will solve it anyway. But science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like, we need prioritization and action and funding. And without those things, we won't solve the issue. So it seemed to me two contradictory statements, and he leans on the defeatist side of politics.
Would you say that he's leaning more? Would you say that to fall on the defeatist side is to fall on the conservative side?
No.
You can go.
No, you go for it.
I mean, I don't think conservatives don't think anything can be done about climate change. And like can't be measured. Right? I think it's just like the way they approach it and the way they want to invest in it is different. Like, I feel like a lot of conservatives don't see it as a imminent threat. I don't know if he does or not. But he might be more, I feel like he might realize it's like important, but be defeatist about it.
So I've heard him talk about climate change a couple of times, and he really likes, do you know who Bjorn Lomborg is? He's like,
no, but I've heard him say that name. I don't know who that is.
He's like a statistician, but he's been investigating the climate change and everything like that. And he makes an argument in one of his books that the typical things people think of as like solutions to climate change might end up doing more damage in the long run than other solutions that are less often talked about, like developing, there's one that he cites as like the most important, something with like child hunger, like solving child hunger will lead to net way less carbon emissions than putting like a carbon tax or something. I don't know. But anyway, so Jordan Peterson quotes him, and he's like, we can do things about climate change, but they aren't the things that people talk about, because people are talking about the more politically expedient stuff. So he seems pretty defeatist because he doesn't accept any of like the popular solutions as valuable. But I don't know enough about climate change to say one way or another. But yeah, he seems defeatist in the sense that he's not on the bandwagon with like the other mainstream solutions.
Well, it wasn't that, it was more his response of like, it's going to get solved anyway.
Right.
And that takes input from people, like that takes a will to change the world from society.
He seems to have kind of this idea that like in his worldview is very individualistic. So he thinks that like just an individual or a few people will just emerge in the course of history who will have like the wherewithal to solve the climate crisis. Like he sort of has this idea, like a very like mythic type idea that just an individual will just emerge like from the ether and have the solutions. But there's precedent for like just individuals bearing great responsibility for solving X, Y, or Z. But there does have to be other conditions leading to that. And so I understand why you're saying it's like defeatist for him to just be like, well, somebody's just going to come along and solve it at some point. So you might as well give up.
Yeah. Relatedly, he says he's not a conservative because he doesn't have the temperament for it, but he's also he's like so a conservative, and this the whole like, I mean, you can tell the ideology of individual responsibility, right? Like people on the left and right to everywhere to some extent hold people individually responsible, but you know, the right really emphasizes if you mess up, it's your fault, or if you succeed, it's your fault. And it's pretty clear from his emphasis of that, you know, on things like, I guess you're connecting it to climate change, right? Like if a great individual is going to come by and solve the problem, his emphasis on the individual, probably because of his background in psychology, I think really makes his ideology line up with a conservative ideology.
Yeah, I heard him say that too. He's like, I'm not a conservative by temperament. It's like, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like he's saying most conservatives are like, what were some of the, I remember him saying that, but I don't even remember why he said like, that's his psychology side coming out again, just being like, if you're a conservative on average, you're more X or you're more, but not actually saying anything like meaningful. He's just saying he's not like the average conservative.
Well, so
he's entirely conservative. He seems kind of moderate to me, to be honest.
I think when he talks about, you know, going back to his psychology, he talks about the big 5 personality traits, right? And he says that conservativeness, the big 5 personality traits are well established, and you know, I learned about them in a psychology course. But and I don't know if this is true, but he says conservativeness is linked with orderliness and
low creativity,
low openness. It was low openness and high orderliness, I believe. So it's possible he just doesn't see himself aligning with those traits. Right. I actually think his view here is, I don't know if it's, you know, objectively true, but it's interesting in the sense that he thinks what connects these two concepts is borders, so like conceptual and physical borders. Mm-hmm. So he thinks that conservatives are like less open to outside ideas and outside people. Mm-hmm. And one interesting point he gives for this is that, and this I have verified, that in the higher the disease prevalence in a state, the higher the like level of conservatism and authoritarianism. And that's because like historically keeping outsiders away when there's disease spreading decreases the incidence of disease. And this is even true like in the US, like the South, like has a higher disease prevalence. Like you can measure this on all different sorts of scales and it holds up.
Wait, are you saying because you're conservative, there's less disease, or because there's disease, you're more conservative?
It's the latter. It's like because where there's more disease, it causes communities to be more conservative.
And there's more disease in the South?
Yeah. So hold on. I mean, you discussed something for a second. Let me see if I have notes on this.
You
So
should just throw some of these numbers around, Tyler.
5.
7. Hello,
Right.
people
Okay.
watching.
It was parasite stress theory. Um,
Sounds like a good name.
more in diseases in areas with more prevalent disease or infectious disease, there is more collectivist and conservative politics. So even if you show someone a picture of a disease, they'll become more conservative in like follow-up questions.
Right.
Did COVID
Yeah,
make the world more conservative?
yeah, probably. Although there's also the effect of, you know, it disproportionately affects a certain age group, which is disproportionately conservative.
That too.
But yeah, so that was interesting, and I think his ideas around this, like, I found to be pretty interesting. I guess, you know, moving on from a critique of him, I think he does have some really interesting points. Like he talks about Nietzsche a lot, and how kind of like in non-religious systems, often you know, the government or something that is traditionally non-religious takes on religious significance. Um, I don't know if like I don't think that's a particularly novel insight, right? So like everyone makes a god of something is a kind of cliche that's thrown around, but I think he does a good job of elaborating these details, kind of summarizing Nietzsche's views on some things. He talks a lot about Hobbes and Rousseau. Um, yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to really say about Jordan Peterson before we talk about morality. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
I think just tying to what the final comment you made, it is important to take account of the fact that he has seemed to an extent to reinvigorate religious or quasi-religious discussion amongst people who might not typically have those discussions. So, for example, his lectures on like Genesis have been viewed and listened to like millions and millions of times. And so he's taking those ancient texts and kind of interpreting them from his perspective as like a psychologist, psychoanalyst, but people are like listening to 3-hour long lectures about like Genesis or Proverbs, you know? So his popularity has kind of, and we talked about this, I think, maybe you weren't there, Jake, somebody else was there. Tyler was there at least. His popularity has dwarfed the popularity of people like Sam Harris at this point, and Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, who's passed away now. But the new atheist movement, I think of like Jordan Peterson being kind of the next stage in whatever this public discussion about religious matters is, where people are seemingly intrigued by religious discussions or what value religions might have for them, even if they don't think it's true or not. And I think that he's kind of part of that kind of just religious conversation, consideration of religious matters seems to be more popular on the internet now than it was like 10 years ago. That's what I would say, as someone who's been on the internet for 10 plus years.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, you know, kind of to segue into the next topic, Jordan Peterson's view is that, you know, God is dead and we have killed him, as Nietzsche said. And I'm not sure he believes that the civilization can cope with the death of religion. So he wants to ground our norms and values and morality in some sense of objectivity because religion is no longer taken to be literally true. And I think to do this, he turns to religion and myth, which he sees as kind of historical codification of values. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask, you know, in what sense, what can replace religion in a secular society? How can we really try and solidify the values that we should be aiming towards, and even just enumerate those values. And to his point, the humanities have kind of been a place to do this historically. But I don't know if this is true. His critique is that the humanities have been more focused on like a sociology of the authors. So like, looking at intent and historical context of the writing to try and determine and maybe criticize what the authors of the text are saying. And he said, and I think that's true a little bit, but he wants to go back to a point where we can mine these texts for all they're worth, like, to mine them for the morals in them and figure out how to have a better collective discussion about the values we should uphold. And I think that's, a noble aim. It's kind of hard to do in a secular society to say like, these are the values we all ascribe to. Mm-hmm. But I think that's kind of his starting point. It's like, formal religion is gone. How can we survive in a world and codify our values in a place where there isn't any agreed upon religion?
How are the humanities codifying values? Like, they're like analyzing things, but how are they like actually like saying these are what our values should be? Or is that not what he says?
Yeah, well, every work of fiction has a moral, or it's not interesting, right? Like,
oh, like fiction. I thought you were saying like sociology.
No. Well, I guess the humanities pretty broad.
The humanities, like classics, literature.
I'm sure sociology has something interesting to say about this as well. But I think he's thinking of literature and the classics and things like that.
Cool.
Yeah. I think that's an accurate assessment. I think it's important to say that he is Nietzschean not in the strong sense. So Nietzsche was
in the weak sense.
In the weak sense, yes. Not in the strong sense, because Nietzsche held that, religion is no longer useful, and he held that there is no God, that God does not exist. Peterson seemingly believes the former, but not the latter. He gives very kind of confused answers when he's asked point blank whether he believes in God or not. It seems like he does, though. It seems like he doesn't think God doesn't exist, because he says, I act as if God exists. And then
I'm pretty sure I would disagree with that.
Okay. Well, you wouldn't disagree with the fact that he has never asserted God does not exist. Nietzsche did assert that.
Never so clearly.
Right. So he's not obviously a strong Nietzschean who thinks that there is no supernatural realm. He makes appeal to the supernatural realm, maybe just to ground these values that he's searching for, but there's definitely more of an openness on his side to the idea of there actually being such a being as God than there is in Nietzsche. And that's also more recent for him too. He did an interview where I can't remember who it was with. Pagot. Do you know who Jonathan Pagot is? Maybe it's Pageau. Well, Pageau was asking him like whether he believes in God or not, whether the Christian story in particular. And he's like, I think it might be true, but it terrifies me to think it might be true. So he seems pretty open to it to me.
Every time he's really pressed, he changes the definition of truth from meaning a system of an inviolable pattern. Like, that's kind of what it means to be true, right? It's like there's an inviolable pattern in the world, and he defines it pragmatically. Right?
Yes.
Like, he says what is true is what is well adapted to the environment. So since religion has been so well adapted to the environment over centuries, another way to phrase this would be, it was a very useful meme in the gene and meme sense. Then it's true insofar as it's a useful meme, is what he would say. It's a very useful abstraction, an extremely useful metaphor. But I think he would admit that, like, Harry Potter and The Lion King are also useful metaphors. They just haven't been as well adapted to every context they've appeared in. I would say that's the case, but it's just not the notion of truth that we really want him to answer when we ask him that question.
I agree.
And when it's true only metaphorically, then it might be true for planning at one level of abstraction, but when you need to do really complex planning about the future, like, maybe treating them as metaphors is far more helpful than acknowledging that they literally exist. Like, you could think of a myth where talking about Zeus as being the god of thunder and Ares being the god of war is a really useful metaphor. And you're trying to figure out like what cultural forces are at play and how they interact with each other. Personifying these forces is actually extremely valuable. But when you actually have to decide, like, is the lightning going to strike right now? You want to ask a climatologist or a weatherman. You don't want to ask someone who studies ancient Roman mythology.
Which is all to say that he's very confusing and ambiguous on the deeper question of whether or not any of this stuff is true, which Nietzsche was not ambiguous on. He was saying, no, it's all false.
Yes.
So that's what I mean.
Yeah, my intro to Nietzsche came many years ago, and
when you were a philosophy major?
When I was taking a course at summer at Brown before college.
Okay.
And my memory of him was kind of like he was refuting pessimism, which was Schopenhauer's kind of main articulation, by suggesting that we have this like desire to engage in successful, challenging activity, which he called the will to power. And so that's like half my understanding. And then the other half is what Jordan Peterson has said about him, which seems like Peterson describes him as prescient in like the prediction of communism, even though he didn't use those words. So he was saying that like Christianity arose, actually Nietzsche called it a slave morality, because he was saying that like the Christians in the Roman Empire, they couldn't have access to like, banquets. So they would like elevate the importance of not being hedonistic, right? And they couldn't have sex with everyone they wanted to. So they would elevate the importance of chastity. And basically every time there was something they wanted to attain and couldn't attain, they would elevate the importance of abstaining from that thing. So that was Nietzsche setting up like Christian. What was that?
Talk about elitist.
Yeah, I know. But that was kind of Nietzsche's view on Christianity. And then he had this really positive take on it also, that like it really emphasized logical thinking and as Peterson likes to say, the word logos. And Nietzsche viewed this as like a person sitting on a tree and sawing off the very branch that supported them, right? So like, you're sitting on this tree of culture that has led you this far, and you're going to use the tools of reason to completely destroy use religion to destroy religion, or use the tools of rationality that religion had been fostering to completely destroy religion. And Nietzsche saw this as bad because I think he saw a lot of culture tied. I mean, I don't think he saw it necessarily as like bad in and of itself, but problematic in the sense that a lot of humans' meaning and values are tied up in religion. And without this, like, how are we going to elevate music and culture and dance and rituals that give us meaning without this formal structure of religion? Mm-hmm. And I think this is really where like Harrison and Peterson clashed, where Harris, sorry, Harris, not Harrison. Peterson was saying like, no, but religion is so useful. And Harris was saying, yeah, but it's not literally true. And it took them like 4 days to to come to this conclusion that that's just where they differ, is like one metaphor is very pragmatically useful and in some contexts isn't. Whereas, it's maybe we have better tools now for some things than religion. And maybe in some domains, the science doesn't yet have as much to tell us about our value system as looking at myths and religions does.
Isn't Harris kind of like having his cake and eating it too? Isn't that the expression? It's something like that, right? You can't. You right? Is that it? Okay.
No, that's it. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Because he's like into ritualistic Buddhism. So he's into evidence-based meditation. What does that even mean, though? I mean,
that's different.
No, there is empirically backed meditation that is not connected to any spiritual text or underlying.
His meditation is entirely distinct from any Buddhism or whatsoever.
He might take inspiration, but as far as I know, And this is pretty.
It's practical.
I think he treats it as a practical method for, you know, calming your nerves, basically, and being aware of your. I think he thinks a lot about consciousness and the nature of consciousness, and he thinks of meditation as a way to get to know yourself.
So in that sense, he finds religion useful.
It's not religion, though.
It's not
Meditation
religious.
is not religious. Unless he is like following other Buddhist philosophies or practices. But I wouldn't say meditation is religious.
No, I wouldn't either, as just an activity. But as far as I remembered, I thought he called himself a secular Buddhist.
I could be wrong, but I haven't heard himself say that. But okay, so maybe we can hash out the main point here, which is that they were debating. They both see great need in making religion grounded in some sense of objectivity. Peterson does this by saying, well, it's well adapted, so that's objective. And Harris does this by saying, well, it's grounded in underlying biology, and there can be, you know, objective facts about subjective things. So, you know, Descartes famously said the thing he cannot doubt is that he exists, right? I think, therefore I am. I would add on to that, like, what's immediately evident to you after the fact that you exist is the fact that you have a certain incentive structure, that some things feel good and some things feel bad, and you have values and motivations. And I would say those are also self-evident. And then the rest of your life is figuring out how you combine those values with the state of the objective world and how you plan for the future in order to maximize how you're going to feel in the future. But I think in some sense, they agree in that Peterson also acknowledges the biological foundations of these, what he would, you know, of these morals. He talked about like wolves having basic moral systems, where if one wolf was, you know, they were play fighting and surrendered to another wolf, and the attacking wolf didn't stop once the submitting wolf stopped playing, then all the other wolves would ignore the bully wolf, and he viewed this as a basic morality. So I think he agrees in the sense that he thinks these have biological underpinnings. I would say that Peterson just stresses the fact that these are hard to know about, and myth and religion can inform us about them. And in that sense,
generally,
yeah, story generally can inform us. Whereas Harris, doesn't necessarily disagree, but he thinks that the path forward is going to be more empirical study, which I find myself in that camp, and that like this is really the point of psychology, is to say, well, you know, after taking X, Y, or Z action, I can't tell you how you're going to feel, but I know because of the biological basis that how you're going to feel is generally very similar to how other humans feel. And maybe I can say that after, you know, killing your brother, 99% of humans are going to feel terrible, like profoundly, deeply terrible, and more profoundly than after doing any other negative thing. And maybe after doing some other action, like, you know, writing your mom a thank you card, 99% of people will feel, or like 70% of people will feel proud, and 30% of people will feel joy. And then, you know, people generally combine these two emotions, will say that joy is worth twice as much as pride, or vice versa. And then, you know, that is a map, that is a much more precise map to maximize our own values than any religion or story could be.
Can I say something? I think there's like a little gap in there, at least in my thinking, that I want to fill in. So Jordan Peterson, as you said, like talks about how religion gives us these stories, like gives us our values, helps us understand values. Sam Harris, I think, specifically responds and says, religion is problematic because it is dogmatic. It asks us to believe everything blindly. Therefore, we should not use it. But at the same time, he does acknowledge that like morality can be communicated well through stories. So maybe we do have like story and metaphor, but it shouldn't be religious. It shouldn't ask you to blindly accept it, and it should be universal, I think he says. And that's where then like he gets, you know, Jordan Peterson pushes back on the universal piece.
And this is where Peterson wants to have his cake and eat it too. right? He wants to say we should use religion, but we shouldn't be dogmatic. Like, I think Peterson agrees on the dogma is bad. And anytime you have only one accepted national like story in whatever culture you live in, that's totalitarianism. And I think he acknowledges that. So I would say this is the point where Peterson likewise wants to have his cake and eat it too.
If I could say something, I think that, well, we're not talking about Sam Harris like in isolated from this larger discussion, but it is interesting how poor Sam Harris's understanding of Christianity is in particular. Just having listened to him talk about it so much, like even the phrase that Tyler used, that Tyler quoting Sam Harris used, where he says like, well, it just teaches you just have to blindly accept it. It's like, well, who says that? Like, Sam Harris says it. Sam Harris says religion has to be blindly accepted.
Well, maybe I'm like Sam Harris, but I would argue my conception of religion is that if you believe it, if you believe that the foundation, the premise is like, for Christianity, Jesus is Son of God, and there, like, if you believe that, you pretty much have to believe everything he said. Like, you can't pick and choose what of God's like tenets you should believe in or follow or right. Like, if you believe in a religion, especially one with a prophet in a book, like, you have to accept it all as truth.
Well, that's a matter of
Sam Harris's point, I think.
But I think Sam Harris's point is more so that taking the first step, like believing the main thing, is you just have to believe it. You just accept it. Just blindly accept it. Meaning somebody asserts X and you just believe it. That's what dogma used in this negative sense typically means.
No, I have two things to say. One is to back Tyler Beck in saying that there are multiple religions out there, and the dangerous part of them is that to actually believe you should do something about them or follow them, you need to believe something like they're the literal word of God. And if you believe they're the literal word of God, then that is extremely dangerous, right? In the same way that
writing down with maybe some fault of the word of God. Like, you don't have to believe that the text is the word of God, but you have to believe that, like, the prophet was God or was the word of God and was written down, and the book is, minor point, but like
elevating some section of the bookstore as Harris says above the rest by making them sacred and unable to be criticized is dangerous. And you have to admit, even if you are religious, that there are other religions out there that are wrong, right? There are plenty of wrong religions out there. Everyone can agree on that. And it's dangerous to have so many people believe that some supernatural power is telling them to literally follow this whole book. There's going to be something dangerous in each of those books.
But Jake, you do
I think, yeah.
Just right into, don't mean to interject. Well, I do though. You do realize that this entire discussion, these last few points that you've made, assume from the outset that there could not ever be such a thing as a sacred text.
No,
you're saying
even if there is a sacred correct text.
No matter what.
Say that again.
You're saying it's going to be dangerous no matter what.
Yeah, I kind of disagree with that point.
So, yeah, well, I would say having so many texts that people believe is the word of a supernatural being is dangerous. And
it's
I would also
dangerous.
And
I agree.
empirically.
And in reality, it has been, obviously.
I don't think
it's a fact that because there is a sacred text and people believe it, it will be dangerous. But I think in practice, yes, it pretty much always will.
And here's a controversial point.
I agree with that, but that's not.
I actually think it's extremely dangerous to ground our morality in stories. It can be or supernatural stories. If I don't kill my brother because I think God told me not to kill my brother, then I have, if someone told me that that's why they weren't going to kill their brother, I would have no faith in them as a person or friend. I would not want to be around that person. I would have, like, the second their belief changes, they might murder me. If someone is not doing it, and if someone is not following their morality because of how it deeply affects them, their reward system, their incentive structure, is instead doing it just because of some belief in a supernatural being, I do not trust that person, and I do not think that is healthy for society. And I think it's extremely dangerous, because the second they believe they were told to murder someone by God, they will.
I think that's true. I mean, that seems fair to an extent.
Oh, I thought that was going to be controversial.
No, I mean, you're basically saying it's people believe things strongly, and those beliefs can change. It's like, okay.
To base morality on beliefs.
To base morality on feelings. Do people's feelings change? I mean, it's this. You can make the same argument about a secular morality.
No, but our feelings are well evolved genetically to provide us with a functioning set of norms.
Our beliefs are well evolved.
No, people believe crazy things.
Well,
your beliefs can change like that. I feel like your beliefs can change based on things very quickly. Your feelings of what you should and shouldn't do to another person deeply do not change like in an instant.
This is nuanced because you're right that our belief systems are well evolved to be well adapted, right? They're memes, but they are memes that are only useful because they reflect the underlying biological reality, which is more fundamental.
No, I disagree. That's a different thing. Back to what Tyler was just saying. Why do you think that?
I was thinking about Jordan Peterson. I gave this critique earlier about how he uses this esoteric and flowery language. So I've been thinking a little bit about what he sounds like when he says these things, because he talks a lot about archetypes, and he has a very particular tone to him. And well, this is my best impression of him so far.
Oh. You're not gonna edit this out, are you?
I don't know. We'll see whether I edit this out.
Yeah.
The mother, the creator, the birther, the progenitor of the known and the unknown, the bivalent figure, the producer of all that is good and all that is malleable.
You didn't say manifests.
Or patriarchy or hierarchy or.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.